So I'd like to introduce Rob Mikkelsen. He's the Director of Agronomy for Yara International, and I'll let him tell you a little bit more about what he does. Thank you.
Great. Well, nice to be part of this today. I recognize a few names on our participants. I've been around California for quite a while. I did my graduate work in Riverside, actually, and was living on an avocado ranch there in Riverside for a number of years, but left there to join the Tennessee Valley Fertilizer Center in Alabama, where most of the fertilizer that's used in the world is developed. Then I was on the faculty at North Carolina State University for about 15 years. I came back to California to join a group called the International Plant Nutrition Institute. Based out, I was living in Merced, but we had programs around the world. I moved to Africa for a few years. Now, the last couple of years, I've been working with Yara on some of their research and education programs. And Yara is a major nitrogen fertilizer company in the world. So I've done a lot of things in different places and always focusing on how to get the best value from plant nutrients. So glad to talk about that with you today. As Mary Lou and Ben were organizing this today, they asked me just to do a review on fertilizers, fertilizer sources, and really what are their differences and how do we make those decisions? Well, one question I get asked a lot is, why do farmers use all this fertilizer anyway? And we've known about the value of plant nutrition for many years. This is an old picture from the Midwest where they were putting on potassium and phosphate. And it didn't take much to convince a farmer that they wanted to use fertilizer compared to what was being naturally provided by the soil. So when people say, why do you use fertilizer? Well, for most farmers, it's pretty clear that they're getting an economic return to that. So when the value of these nutrients were provided, there was sort of a gold rush boom to get nutrients anywhere they could. And you may have seen old advertisements like this where they were mining guano off the coast of South America, and they were collecting buffalo bones. Some amazing pictures. Buffalo bones are rich in hydroxyapatite or phosphorus. And so when those are treated, those are a valuable source of nutrients. So they were looking everywhere to get nutrients to boost their food. I like to say, well, the reason why we're using nutrients is this matter of balance. We remove a lot of nutrients in the crops every time we harvest, and we need to replace those. And Rand talked about sort of the nutrient export that comes off of the fields in the avocados. So whatever we're harvesting, we're taking nutrients from the field, and at some point those need to be put back from some source, or we deplete our soils. And I spent a number of years working in Africa where they have very degraded, depleted soils. And it just is a catastrophe in many ways, environmentally as well as from a human aspect. So when we take things off the soil, at some point we have to put them back. And most soils don't contain the optimal balance of nutrients for the plant growth we're trying to achieve. People say, well, the forests seem to grow just fine. You know, the grasslands seem to grow fine. Well, that is true, but we're not trying to maximize the productivity of the grasslands or the forest. And so it's okay if those take 50 years, 100 years to grow, where with a avocado tree, we're trying to get it to grow to maximize that return on our investment. So most soils are low in at least one nutrient, and that prevents the plant from reaching its full potential. So if we can identify that and through leaf analysis, through soil analysis, through sap analysis, then we can overcome those limitations. So I know nobody spends valuable fertilizer money just willy-nilly on putting out fertilizer. And that is unfortunately the perception for much of the public, that it's really not a very scientific process, but in actuality, it is very sophisticated. And I'd love to go into more detail on some of these things, and we could talk about that either during the Q&A, or I have my email address there at the end, and we can continue the conversation online. So of these essential nutrients, 13 of them come from the soil. And I just put this together as the relative concentrations. So if nitrogen was 1 million units, we get down to molybdenum and nickel, and that would be, doesn't even show up on my graph there, 2 units. So it doesn't mean that nitrogen is more essential, but it's needed in greater quantities. And this varies depending on the crop and some other things, but this is just an average. So although the micronutrients are needed in low concentrations, they are still just as essential. So none of them are more essential than others. And another thing that I think is helpful to remember is that nutrients are only taken up when they're dissolved in the water. I heard someone say recently that plants drink their nutrients. So if the nutrients are there in the soil, but they're not in a soluble form in the water, then they're not useful for plant uptake, which means you also have to have water for this process to occur. So in a drought condition, when the soils are dry, not only are the plants not taking up nutrients, they're also not taking up water. So they go together. And we'll talk a little bit later about the importance of water management in proper nutrient management. So I like some of these pictures. This is really what we're trying to do, is to get healthy roots and then get the water and the nutrients to those roots. And let's just watch these root hairs grow in time. So these are single cells reaching out from the root. And this is what we're trying to get in a healthy environment, this root health that we talk about, get the proper water, get the proper nutrition. And you can see sort of the goodies moving around inside that single cell as it's taking up nutrients and bringing it back to the plant. So really an intricate process that we're working on. So once we have healthy roots, we have nutrients, we have water, and those nutrients are being taken up by the plant. It really doesn't matter where those nutrients originated as far as the plant is concerned, whether it came from decaying crop residues, whether it came from fertilizer, came from mineralized soil organic matter, it came from added compost and manure. Using nitrate as an example here, that NO3 molecule is all the same as far as the plant is concerned. Now, how we manage it, how it impacts the soil, how it impacts some of the other management things are all different depending on the source. But as far as the plant is concerned, that nitrate is the same. So, and plants primarily take these nutrients up as inorganic sources. And there's some research showing that plants can take up small organic molecules, but generally that contributes very little to the overall nutrition of the plant. Some of the amine compounds, for example. So again, just as way of background, these plants need a sufficient supply of all of these nutrients to get the maximum yield. And Ron gave us a nice discussion about how those nutrients also affect the quality of the plants. And it's a common mistake to focus on the macronutrients because those are the ones required in the largest quantity. Usually we think about nitrogen and then phosphorus and potassium, and then we let the other nutrients maybe come and go. But if any of those are in short supply, then the whole plant suffers. And not only is it needed in the right supply, but there are peak demand periods, and we'll have an example of that, when the plant is taking up a lot of potassium. And if that potassium supply runs short, then the plants start to suffer again. So on average, there may be plenty of, say, potassium in the soil, but it may not be sufficient to meet some of those peak demand periods. And before people jump into the fertility of the plant, I always say, well, wait a minute, you need to look at the whole system. Are there problems with compaction? Are you delivering a lot of salinity in the water? What is the water quality like? Or bicarbonates? We are seeing a growing incidence of soil acidity, actually, which is something we never thought we'd see in California, as we use ammonium fertilizers or urea fertilizer, over time, ammonium and urea convert to nitric acid in the soil. And we're seeing right under those emitters, we're getting more and more acidification. And we did some work on some almond orchards recently up in the North Valley, and the pH started about pH 7, and it's now underneath those emitters about pH 5 after many years of applying this acid forming nitrogen fertilizer. So don't just jump in and say, okay, let's fix the nutrition. You have to fix the whole system to make this work. And so again, just focus on everything in the management system. Okay. This is what Ben asked me to talk about a little bit more, is about selecting that right source. So we need to really, again, step back. Don't just jump into the fertilizer, but figure out what's your production goals. What are those nutrient limitations, looking at soil and plant analysis. And for a lot of annual crops, we encourage farmers to do what we call nutrient omission plots. Say, leave out the nitrogen and see what it does. Are you getting a bang for your buck here or not? A little harder to do with trees, but some of you are involved as crop advisors with many different crops, and you can leave just a little unfertilized strip and you get a great visualization of what that nutrient is, whether it's missing N, P, K, or some of the secondary or micronutrients. So in general, when we're looking at fertilizer sources, there's a few different kinds. One are these dry bulk blends where you mix the least expensive nitrogen source, phosphorus source, and potassium source in a ratio that meets the needs of your crop or meets the needs of your soil analysis. So these are generally the least expensive because they can be easily mixed of different materials. The green in this picture is phosphorus, the white is nitrogen, and the red is potassium. So you can change those ratios in blending these. So generally, this is the least expensive. Not all fertilizers can be mixed, and then you need to be careful if you're transporting these and they jiggle along the road for many miles on a bumpy road. The ones that are least dense tend to segregate to the top. The ones that have the highest density tend to settle to the bottom. And so when you start spreading these in the field, you may not get the distribution that you are expecting or what came out of the fertilizer plant. So these dry bulk blends are extremely popular in many places. This is another one that is used to be really popular and still popular in some applications. And these are these compound fertilizers. And there's different ways of making these where they can, you see in the bottom picture where they actually glue different pieces of NPK together. Or there's another method in the center there where they spray different layers of fertilizers, or the one on the right where they actually melt the NP and K together to form a solid fertilizer. And they all work approximately the same, but each nutrient, each granule contains the exact same nutrient ratio as what's guaranteed on the label. They're easy to handle, easy to apply, generally a little bit more expensive, and you can't change that ratio. You just get whatever the fertilizer dealer has. So you can't tailor it to exactly what the plant needs or perhaps what the soil might be deficient in. But these are very popular. Get used a lot on turf and for homeowners. And this is certainly something that's more familiar to most of you, is these fluid fertilizers or the liquid fertilizers. These clear liquids, the green in this case is a phosphorus fertilizer. The clear in this photo is urea ammonium nitrate. And those can be blended in lots of different ratios, including potassium. And they can be added to irrigation water. We use them for foliar nutrients. So this, I think, is what most of you are using for your avocado nutrition. It always bears warning that not all of these can be mixed. That green fertilizer, the phosphorus fertilizer, the polyphosphate, is very reactive with lots of different things. And so you've got to be careful, especially with calcium, or it will form a cheese-like goo at the bottom of your mix tank of calcium phosphate. So we always encourage people to use a jar test or test something in a small batch before you make 1,000 gallons of this material. Usually your fertilizer dealer knows pretty well what is compatible and what's not. But if you're doing this at your own ranch, be careful, but there are some guides to doing that. One of the advantages of fluid fertilizers going through fertigation is that we can use high frequency, low volume irrigation. And this is a practice that is really revolutionizing fertilizer efficiency. So instead of putting on fertilizers 2, 3, or 4 times a year, we can put it on every week, or every 2 weeks in a very small amount and maintain the optimal concentration of nitrogen, especially in that root zone. And in an environment where we're regulated heavily by the state and want to minimize that nitrate loss, high frequency, low volume is a way to keep that nitrogen there in the top foot of soil and keep it there in the root zone. So clear liquids are a great way to manage nutrients very effectively. And there's charts such as this, which if you look at fertilizers on the left-hand side and then going down along the diagonal, you can see, is it compatible? Is it compatible with limits, or is it incompatible and is going to precipitate? So there's many charts like this. This one is from a group called the Fluid Fertilizer Foundation. But you can see which fertilizers can be mixed and which ones can only be mixed with caution in a tank. So it's important to know their properties and know which ones can be used where. There's another one that we don't use a lot in the avocado industry, but this is used more for row crops probably, and those are suspension fertilizers. We won't spend a lot of time talking about that, but it's almost like making, it's like milk or a thin pudding, if you will, where you use a clay material to gel that liquid a little bit, and that gel holds the fertilizer particles, very small particles, in suspension. And you can get a higher concentration of nutrients by doing this than you can with clear fluids. And then last, we see some of the enhanced efficiency fertilizers. Rand talked about using nitrification inhibitors. That's a form of enhanced efficiency. We have urease inhibitors. We also have these coated fertilizers that are popular in some areas. And depending on that thickness of that coating, we can delay the release of the nutrients from a few weeks to up to several months, depending on the temperature and the moisture. So again, these are going to be increasingly important in environmental sensitive areas, but again, I think using fluid fertilizers is what we really want to focus on. And then we had a little discussion about these organic nutrients, and these are great sources of nutrients. The difficulty is they require mineralization of that organic nitrogen before the plants can use them. And so often we look at the carbon to nitrogen ratio of these, and that helps us predict how fast the microbes can break that down. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Another interesting thing is most of the phosphorus in organic materials is present as inorganic phosphate, and it behaves identical to fertilizer. And again, we'll talk about that. The potassium is 100% or 99% in the inorganic form, and that also behaves just like fertilizer will do. So nitrogen is the challenging one, to get it to release at the time that synchronizes with the plant demand. And it's always important to think, well, where do these nutrients come from? If we're using dairy manure, for example, the cows don't produce any nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium. Again, they're eating the grass crop, converting it to manure, and that's getting applied on an organic field. But at some point, that phosphorus, that nitrogen, that potassium has to come from somewhere. So often we're taking the nutrients from one field in an organic form and applying it to another field And that's not sustainable unless we replenish those nutrients at some point. So I think that thought about where those come from is important. So nitrogen fertilizer starts with this step of making ammonia. All nitrogen fertilizers start here. And the Haber-Bosch process converts the methane, the CH4, with nitrogen gas into ammonia. And from there, we make all kinds of different fertilizers. Well, it all starts as ammonia, and with methane, you may have heard of something called green ammonia, and that's a little bit confusing. The ammonia is just the same as conventional ammonia, but instead of using methane, we're using electricity to split the water, to rip that water molecule off and get the hydrogen off of it. The oxygen goes back into the atmosphere. So that doesn't release carbon dioxide, doesn't have any greenhouse gases that are emitted when you make green ammonia. So the ammonia is the same. It's not colored green or anything, but it's made with electrolysis and hydrolysis of splitting that water instead of using methane. So you're certainly going to hear more about green ammonia. All the major fertilizer companies have invested billions of dollars in this low carbon nitrogen source. And using electricity is more expensive than using methane. So this green ammonia is going to be more expensive. And I can't tell you exactly how much more, but just the cost of production is higher. So that means the retail cost is going to be more. We know that nitrate, ammonium, urea, those are the most common sources, and we'll talk about those just a little bit more. But each of those have different chemical properties and behaves differently in the soil. And as we'll talk about, crops have different preferences for that different nitrogen sources as well. So nitrogen has the biggest visual impact of when that's deficient. You go by a field like this. I took this picture driving by. I know what the applicator got plugged on the strip right here. It's pretty easy to see, and that often gets the most attention. So as we talked about, it's maybe tempting to overdo that. And Ron explained that really nicely, how the negative impacts of over application of nitrogen, especially for avocados, but for every crop, it has a negative implication. But nitrogen is just really hard to manage. There's so many ways that it can escape into the atmosphere. Farmers are under a lot of pressure to manage nitrogen carefully, but there are so many ways that it can be slippery and get lost that even when you're doing perfect nitrogen management, we're never going to have the recovery that we hope to have. Just thinking of why we want to improve nitrogen efficiency and how that relates to fertilizer selection. Well, obviously it's expensive, and the prices shot up last year as a consequence of the shortage of nitrogen coming from Russia and Ukraine. They're major producers. In California, we hear about this all the time: nitrate in the drinking water, eutrophication, hypoxia, biodiversity. Some interesting work done with ammonia and smog. Some of these ammonia pockets settle over the Central Valley. Ozone depletion. In a big way, we've been hearing about nitrous oxide and CO2 contributing as greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And we'll circle back to that in just a minute again. So lots of motivations to use that nitrogen efficiently. We'll just run through some of this very quickly. I don't want to go through these in detail and just talk about them quickly, but just wanted to document them in the presentation, and we can get into more detail later on. This is one that was very popular for many years because of the explosive properties of ammonium nitrate. When it's mixed with a carbon source, it's not available very much anymore. And it actually still is used as an explosive in the mining industry. So ammonium sulfate's commonly used. We can make that using ammonia and sulfuric acid, used in a lot of places where there's a need for additional sulfur. This is the one we're probably most familiar with, urea ammonium nitrate. They heat a solution of urea and ammonium nitrate, and that's blended together. And half of that nitrogen is from urea, 1/4 comes from ammonium, and 1/4 comes from nitrate. So generally it's an ammonium-based fertilizer still, but very soluble, goes through irrigation systems well, and can be used as a foliar nutrient source also. Urea, this is the #1 nitrogen fertilizer used in the world, partly because it's 46% nitrogen, it's very high, so it makes it easy to transport and move around. It's very soluble, but its major problem is if it sits on the soil surface, much of that nitrogen can be lost as ammonia gas. And in some situations, even half or more can be lost as a ammonia gas. So we want to get that urea into the soil, get it off the soil surface as quickly as possible. It has lots of other uses besides fertilizer. It's used for animal feed. It's also very common to use for diesel trucks. It reduces the NOx emissions. So truck drivers use about 20 gallons of urea or UAN for every 5,000 miles they drive. So this has actually become one of the competitors for fertilizer now, that the trucking industry can pay more for urea than farmers want to. So it's sort of a battle of economics. So we use urea in lots of different situations. This could be a nitrogen source, more of a phosphorus source, is the ammoniated phosphates, MAP and DAP, containing about 11% nitrogen or 18% nitrogen. Those are used in lots of different industrial and food purposes as well. So we can go into that more if you're interested. Ammonia is still used quite a bit in California and in the Corn Belt, partly because it's such a high nitrogen product, 82% nitrogen, that it makes it very economical, but it's a real headache and it's pretty dangerous. So you need special equipment, you need pressurized tanks, but you still see that being used in different places, again, but not so much for the avocados. Calcium nitrate's another one that's very commonly used. It can be found as a solid material where it contains about 15.5% nitrogen, or there's different fluid formulations. They call it CN9, calcium nitrate 9%, CAN, CAN17, which is a mixture of calcium and ammonium nitrate. And there's UCAN, which contains a little bit of urea. So a lot of calcium nitrate blends that are very popular, partly because it contains a nitrate source, but also it contains soluble calcium. And I talked about the importance of maintaining a soluble source of calcium in the root zone all the time. Another reason why the calcium nitrates become popular is that there are versions of this that are low in carbon footprint. You say, well, why does that really matter? Well, most of the major food companies have made big pronouncements that they're going to lower their carbon footprints and they're going to increase their sustainability. And one way they can do that is to require that the people they buy their food from also lower their carbon footprint. And nitrogen fertilizer is one of the major contributors of carbon footprint in many growing systems. So with calcium nitrate, they can reduce the scope 1 emissions, they call it, which is from manufacturing. They can get that much lower than for other nitrogen fertilizers. And scope 3 emissions occur when ammonium is nitrified to nitrate. A little bit of that nitrogen leaks out of the soil as nitrous oxide. And so by skipping that step, by using a nitrate source directly, you eliminate those scope 3 emissions. So you can greatly reduce the carbon footprint of fertilizer and production practices by using this calcium nitrate. So you'll definitely be hearing more about that and receiving pressure from some of the people that are buying our food products, from fruit to vegetables to the grain crops and cotton. All these industries are saying we want farmers to lower their carbon footprint, and this is an easy way to do it. And potassium nitrate, is also a great nitrogen source. I mean, look at the solubility on this one. It's 316 grams per liter compared to calcium nitrate, which is almost 1,300 grams per liter. So different solubilities are also something to watch out for. So Ben asked me to talk quickly about some of the organic options. There's things we can buy as organic materials, alfalfa meal, corn gluten, cottonseed, soybean meal. These are all used commercially for organic nitrogen fertilizers. The animal byproducts, blood meal and feather meal are two common ones. We see the kelp products as a potash source, and then some of the mined products like sodium nitrate, which can be used as a limited extent for organic production. And those come from the desert deposits in Chile and Peru. So these are products, again, some of them require that breakdown, that organic mineralization before the plants can use them, but they're excellent. They're usually quite a bit more expensive than the inorganic versions. So they make a great source of nutrients, but as Ron mentioned, often they contain a lot more phosphorus than we want. And that ends up in a lot of surplus phosphorus that can be lost sometimes. We have restrictions on raw manures, and some composts can be very slow to release their nutrients. And just wanted to give an example about one of the difficulties of using some of these organic sources to get the right amount and then to figure out the rate of release. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. This is some work done where they looked at 107 dairy manure samples. They incubated them for 8 weeks to see how much nitrogen is going to be released from this dairy manure. And of that, on average, 13% of that nitrogen was mineralized, but 20% of the samples actually removed nitrogen from the soil. They immobilized it, and some of them had up to 55% mineralization, or half the nitrogen released. So if you were given a cow manure sample and said, use this as a nutrient source, it can be anywhere on this graph. Half of it might be released, or it might be immobilizing nitrogen. So it's very hard to predict some of these things from dairy manure, for example. This is work that Mark Buchanan did. Some of you know him in the Central Coast, looking at different composts. So he was looking at how much nitrogen was released. So looking at the check, which was just mineralization of the native soil organic matter. The green manure, after 20 days, barely released any nitrogen at all compared to a blend of different sources. And that's compared to poultry, which released a fair bit of nitrogen. So again, compost is not compost. Even though these are mature composts and they're suitable for field application, they don't behave anywhere in the same way. So I wanted to talk about some other things that really matter, and we're looking at plants don't use much urea. They use generally nitrate or ammonium, and urea becomes hydrolyzed to ammonium, and that becomes nitrified to nitrate, or the ammonium goes straight to the nitrate, or we add nitrate directly as in those sources of nitrogen. When we use organic materials, those have to be converted to ammonium and nitrate. So a lot of these conversion processes are happening in the soil, and we're trying to predict what's going to occur. Well, this is some work we've been doing recently. I had some good pictures of this one. This is in the almond family, the Rosacea, where we did work growing almonds with 100% nitrate and no ammonium on the left to 100% ammonium on the right with no nitrate. And you look that as soon as we start to add some ammonium into this growth media, the plants begin to be stunted and they don't grow well. So many plants have a strong preference for nitrate or ammonium. And we've done this with a number of crops now, but for tree crops, we've only done this with with almonds and with apricots so far, and the response is very similar. We've done this with strawberries, where the strawberries are very healthy with nitrate. and they're very unhealthy when you start to add ammonium. So the source of nitrogen can really make a difference here. And there was an article that was just published in the last few weeks. I put it down there at the bottom, the optimal ammonium to nitrate ratio for various crops. So again, you can go back to look at this when Mary Lou posts it, but nitrogen is not nitrogen as far as most crops are concerned. This is some work that was done with avocados several years ago. They looked at shoot growth, and I just put a little bit of their data there. When it was all nitrate, the shoots were about 43 grams on their measurement. When they used all ammonium, the plants were about, it was not quite half, but maybe reduced by a third. And they concluded that increasing the proportion of ammonium depressed dry matter accumulation, shoot extension, and branching. So avocados definitely have a preference for nitrate as well, or maybe a tolerance for ammonia, but they don't grow as well. So we want to get that urea ammonium nitrate into the nitrate form as fast as we can, or maybe use a nitrate source of fertilizer to begin with, because that urea, the ammonium, they're all going to end up as nitrate through these biological processes, but the time it takes to get there is going to vary. And so this is, we look at nitrification rates, and nitrification is very temperature sensitive. This is some data from California. So in very cold soils at 35 degrees, it takes a long time for that nitrification to occur, compared to warm soils where nitrification occurs, and it's mostly all complete within a week or two at that 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, with UAN, 3/4 of that nitrogen is in the ammonium or ammonium forming form, which is not the kind that the almond trees want. So picked up, there's a nice website, Greencast Online, which gives you soil temperature today, or you can look at the last month, or lots of things. This is the 5-year average of the soil temperature in Ventura for the last, for 5 years over the year. And so it gets down to about 50 degrees in the winter at the surface temperature, and then gets to a high of mid 80s at that surface temperature in midsummer. And today when I looked at it, I clicked on it, and it was 54 degrees this morning, your soil temperature. So if we go back and look at this now, well, it's right now we're at 50 degrees. So our nitrification is going to be complete in about 3 months to get that ammonium to nitrate. In the summer, when your soils are 75 degrees, that nitrification occurs very fast. So this, it's not just theoretical, but how fast can we get that nitrogen to the form that the plants prefer makes a difference. So summer fertilization, you probably don't need that nitrate, but winter fertilization, that nitrate-based fertilizer probably is better for the trees. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through, Ben asked me to talk about phosphorus and potash. I showed you that picture of the buffalo bones earlier. Bones were the major source of phosphorus early on, and there's some great advertisements from the 1800s looking at, we're using mastodon bone for our fertilizer. Must have been pretty crazy to think, well, this is the best phosphorus you can get. So anyway, and so as I mentioned, bones contain mostly hydroxyapatite. So still you can buy bones for use in organic fertilizer. But bones are very stable. That's why we can still find dinosaur bones out in nature, because those bones have not broken down. But when you add some acid to those bones, it dissolves those bones and changes that phosphorus to what they called early single superphosphate. That was reacting bones with sulfuric acid. Well, we don't use bones very much anymore. In the United States, we get our phosphorus primarily from Florida, from Idaho, and from North Carolina. Morocco is the largest reserve or resource of phosphorus in the world, and they have about 70% of the world's phosphorus reserve in Morocco. And they use big equipment to dig this out. I think we'll skip over some of this, but single superphosphate, triple superphosphate, those granular fertilizers are great phosphorus sources, but if we use them in avocado orchards, we're thinking, well, how much water does it take to move that phosphorus down where the roots are? Sure, we can put a granule fertilizer on, but in an area where it may not rain for a while, is in much of our avocado region, that phosphorus may, and the nitrogen and the potassium might just sit at the soil surface, and we're not getting the value of it. So fluid fertilizers are one that we use through the irrigation system occasionally, and that generally is ammonium polyphosphate. And there they mix phosphorus, they link these phosphate molecules together to make it soluble and adaptable through an irrigation system. And that's that green fertilizer that we see sometimes. And skip over some of this. So in many places, they use phosphorus through an irrigation system. Here it's going onto a cotton field. But again, phosphorus wants to react with everything. It wants to react with calcium, magnesium, ammonium, iron. So you've got to be careful to know your water chemistry before you start putting phosphorus through an irrigation system. Phosphorus is very reactive. When we put fertilizer in the soil, we generally have H2PO4 or HPO4, and that again wants to react with something. In this case, it wants to react with the soil, and then the soil slowly releases it again. So this is a good image for me, is seeing how that phosphorus starts to form crystals on the surface of soil. So not all of it is visible like this in crystals, but most of the phosphorus gets absorbed or gets attached to that, to whatever solid materials are there, be it clay or in this case, it's calcite. And then it slowly releases or slowly dissolves again and gives it back to the plant. I mentioned this is an interesting study, but just one that I chose, that again, most of the phosphorus in manures and compost is present as inorganic phosphorus, just the same as fertilizer. So in beef manure, for example, 75% of that phosphorus is not in organic forms, it's actually as inorganic phosphate. Compost manure, that number goes up. Poultry litter, swine. So we're going to treat that just like we would treat fertilizer. If you do have phosphorus in organic forms, there's a series of enzymes that break these down, and we won't go into that now. And managing the pH is very important to maximizing your phosphorus availability. Between 6 and 7 is generally where we have the greatest solubility of that phosphorus coming off of that soil. Again, potash, to finish up, where does that come from? It comes from ancient oceans that are now either covered up or some of them are still on the surface. Some of the greatest and largest potash reserves are in Canada, and they're now buried about a half a mile deep. The same is in Belarus and Russia. Those are where the biggest potash deposits are in the world. But there's also some where we're currently extracting brines from, for example, the Great Salt Lake, or collecting them from Israel still. Israel has a very active potash industry. If you fly into the Salt Lake Airport sometime, you can see these evaporation ponds where they're collecting the potash from the brine of the Great Salt Lake. So different sources, some come from underground deposits, some come from surface deposits. One of the most common is potassium chloride, where they're mining that deep underground with big machines. Potassium sulfate is either mined or evaporated from the Great Salt Lake in this picture there, or they can make it with potassium chloride and sulfur. Another common one is K-mag, which is a mineral called langbonite. Potassium nitrate is another common one. And some other one, potassium thiosulfate, which you're familiar with, as a liquid source that can go through fertigation. There are some cautions about using a lot of thiosulfate because that can be damaging to plant roots if you use too much. And another one that's just being released is potassium formate, which seems to have some really interesting properties and doesn't damage the roots like some of the other potash sources can. So when we put potassium in the soil, whether it's chloride, sulfate, potassium nitrate, langbonite, or the K-mag, potassium thiosulfate, or the potassium phosphate, it all forms the same potassium. Somehow my animations got off, but the potassium is the same in all of those. So as far as the plant cares, it doesn't make any difference. So what matters is what comes along with that phosphate, whether it's chloride, and with avocados, we try to keep that chloride as low as possible. So we wouldn't want to use potassium chloride. Potassium sulfate, and the potassium's the same, it's the nitrate or the thiosulfate that comes along. The salt index is something else that we need to worry about and think about. There are some organic sources of potassium, not very good. Truthfully, they don't dissolve fast. It's glauconite. We could talk sometime, and maybe we'll do this in a future discussion about foliar fertilizers and how we can use those to either take care of deficiencies or some temporary deficiencies during periods of high demand. But there's a lot of great foliar fertilizers to talk about. Not only spraying them, but how to get them into the leaf so the plants can use them. So water management, as we wrap up here, is really the key to getting proper nutrient efficiency. Some work we've done looking at putting a dye into the irrigation water and then running the irrigation system and seeing where does that fertilizer go? How deep does it go in a long irrigation set or a short irrigation set? And you can see that in 1 hour, that fertilizer is still at the top. If we run for 4 hours, that fertilizer is now washed beneath the root zone. So the water management is critical to getting nutrient management right, getting that right source, rate, time, and place, or the 4R concept that we talk about. And I thought Ben was going to talk a little bit about this today, but he's not joining us. So we need to talk about the right time. And Ben and some other people wrote a really nice article a few years ago about what is the pattern of nutrient accumulation? When does the plant really need this N, P, K in these graphs? And then talking about the right place, how do we apply this so the roots can access them? So I had a friend that gave me a package of donut seeds and said, if you plant these, you can grow donuts. They were actually Cheerios in the seed package. And his comment was, well, if you're looking for an easy way to do it, there is no easy way to do it. There are no easy answers for nutrient management. And Ron talked about the details of how sophisticated this is and how much we need to learn still. So requires a lot of careful attention. So I've given you just a real overview of some of the nutrient source possibilities, how to manage those, where they come from, how to use them. And again, we can talk about this for a long time. And it's sort of a passion of mine that I've spent my career working on helping farmers select that right source to get the optimum yield, to get the best quality and yield and return on their investment, and then to protect the environment. So, Mary Lou, with that, we better stop and we'll see if there's some questions that Ron and I can address.